Hey everybody, Conscious Medium Brandon Ross and David Crosby. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young occasionally. Passed away in January 18th, 2023. Early in the year, passing at just the right time. Well, in this stream of consciousness, we're going to take a look at what made David Crosby so unique. He had highlights, he had lowlights. And we're going to take a look at three major events in David Crosby's life to help you understand the astrology of a man who went through a lot of stuff. Yeah, we're going to talk about addiction. We're going to talk about transplants. And we're going to talk about why he left at the perfect time on the next stream of consciousness. Hey everybody, it's Conscious Medium Brandon Ross. You didn't think I'd just leave you there, did you? Oh, heck no. David Crosby, the man with the walrus mustache, the man who is Melissa Etheridge's baby daddy, lived a pretty unique life. He was born in Hollywood, California in 1941, and he was the centerpiece of the music industry for a long time. What I want to take a look at first is when he was born, he actually had a really kind of unique thing in his chart. And most creative people, you look for things like, where their natal chart really lends itself to their creativity. Well, he's got a very interesting thing that you don't see in a lot of people. Probably part of the reason why it made him so unique. So as we take a look at his natal chart, I want to point out what made him tick. I also want to remind you to like and subscribe this channel. And if you like your own stuff read, if you like to see your monthly astrology, become a member, because that's where all of that content is sitting back in the membership stuff. So for a few dollars a month, you can have that delivered right to your inbox. We're a really cool community. We're growing every day. And we talk about fun stuff like, I don't know, David Crosby. Here we are. All right, guys, so a couple of things here. David Crosby being born April 8th, 1941, Hollywood, California, at 9:02, first 11 jumping in there. Pay attention to the numbers and the numerology, especially when somebody has passed. They tend to leave clues as to what they had going on. Now, in a static conversation, I would have said that this is a pretty private person, and by and large, David Crosby generally was, except for a couple of things. First of all, in the 12th house, he does have his moon and his south node in Pisces. That is going to come up later on. If we were telling a story like a movie, it'd be called foreboding. But he really doesn't have anything else in his 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, or 11th house. And I really hope you get the pun that I'm about to say. His chart is a bowl. Insert laugh track here. His predominant houses are the 5th house, where his sun resides, and the 6th house, where Neptune, North Node, and Venus are the players there. Now, the 6th house in Virgo is kind of a natural setting, which makes him an Aries rising. His moon is in Pisces, and of course, he is a Leo. Leo in the 5th house are people that have a ton of creative energy. So you take a look at the 5th house, which is creativity. It's natal with Leo. This guy was a natural powerhouse to come up with chords and vocals and conversations. His 2nd house, having Saturn in it, allows him to have had the foundation throughout his life to really push forward. And the rebellion sitting in Gemini here in the 2nd house allows it to look a little different. Now, there's healing monikers that come about this, and again, also foreboding. The Chiron sitting right next to his sun means that he's going to have a lifetime of struggles trying to heal. It is conjunct, almost exact to the 10th degree. What that tells us is a very important dynamic that allows us to recognize that this is purposeful in its placement. Also purposeful in the placement is the Taurus placement of Lilith at 29 degrees. At the anaric angle degree, there's a point of emphasis. It's almost a point of angelic pieces to it. This also incurs that he will probably marry once and very well, and guess just what he did. He married once very well. It's interesting, too, that he would have in his first house Mars. So he also has this tendency from a personality standpoint to be a little tumultuous or an advocator. By the way, Capricorn in the 10th house for David Crosby means that reputation was everything. Being able to sustain any of the bad conversations or the whatever is really super important. He also, his voids, his 7th house not having anything in it, but his 2nd house being so chock full, means that the people that he was going to be partnered with weren't going to be fly-by-nighters. The 11th house, for the same reason of the 7th house, that he was going to bring these people close and work with them forever. He started making music with Stills and Nash in 1967, and he never stopped. Ever. Now, his creative juices are also fueled by having Pluto, as well as Mercury, in this 5th house, all sitting in Leo. He is a charge and go get him kind of guy. What's interesting, too, about this is that it forms the squares with the moon. It also, he's got a ton of trine action with Saturn to Jupiter, or to Neptune. Pay attention, it's called foreboding. Here from the 2nd to the 6th house. Now let's focus in just on the 6th house here for just a second. And by the way, I've got plenty of still shots here coming up and going forward. Do you remember when, remember that song Southern Cross? It's kind of a fun song. Well, it was taken from another one called Seven Boots. And a guy by the name of Curtis actually did a demo on it. And it ended up on, it eventually got retooled and got put on the Crosby, Still, Nash album called Daylight Again. Well, I did a little digging and I started to realize that David Crosby actually doesn't get any singing credit, but he does get writing credit, and he also gets producer credit. Well, the Southern Cross conversation is actually in reference to, well, just that, the Southern Cross. It's actually an astrological conversation. Now, what's the Southern Cross in history? Well, let's talk about this for a second. The Southern Cross sits in the Southern Hemisphere. All of the Southern Hemisphere is able to see it, and up to about 35 degrees in the Northern Hemisphere, which is probably from, say, Florida down, right? By the way, if you draw that parallel, the Middle East fits underneath that. Now, where have you seen the Southern Cross before? Well, the Southern Cross is where the sun actually dies for 3 days and rises again on the 25th of December. It is a cross metaphor of the sunrise of Jesus. You might have read it in the Bible. But astronomically, it actually points to Alpha Centauri. Well, Alpha Centauri, you're like, I've seen that before. I've heard that before. David Crosby was a huge fan, and so was Stills, and Nash was a little more of like, I just cut my hair. I don't know if I believe in you guys. Do you see what I did there? They were big fans of Eric Van Dyken. Chariots of the Gods had come out a few years earlier, and they'd always kind of been a fan, both of the book and of the movie, which you should go watch that if you're going to hang out with me long enough. And they were always obsessed with the way that the stars looked. Well, a little side note about David Crosby. He was also an avid sailor, and he actually got Stills and Nash to get into sailing as well. And the Southern Cross is really about sailing around Australia. How important is the Southern Cross to Australia? It's on its flag. Take a look. It also points to Alpha Centauri. Again, I've been teasing it long enough. What is Alpha Centauri? It is our closest neighbors to our solar system. If we were going to get on a pony bank and go to the nearest star, it is Alpha Centauri. So the Southern Cross was doing more than just becoming a biblical calling card for the sun god. It was also letting us know where our closest neighbor was. By the way, what is the act of astrology but in that astrological cross? Well, Crosby, Stills, Nash decided to do a song, rechange it, inspired by the sailing. And by the way, they decided to throw on these 3 alien ships. Now, what was going on with Crosby that he wasn't necessarily too much into that album? Well, he was dealing with a little bit of how do you do. This is when he went a little bit crazy and he took a little bit of cocaine and he was waving around a little bit of a gun. As a matter of fact, this time was so interesting to him that I want to take a look at it astrologically. By the way, his bandmates were looking out for him. Remember how I showed you the second house and how he was going to have a foundation and stay together with a band? That band made sure he was clean by giving him producer credit, writing credit, and making sure he had revenue while he went away for 8 months and got himself cleaned up. By the way, subsequently, he married his wife shortly after that and stayed his wife for the rest of his days. But let's take a look at astrologically why it is that he went through this. And it's really kind of an interesting conversation here because, by the way, we're gonna keep David behind the scene here. We're not gonna make him do the perp walk yet. So we're just gonna focus in on the timeline. By the way, the inside is his natal chart. That won't change. But on the outside of this, I want you to pay attention to Neptune. Neptune's a key player for this creative son of a gun. Neptune is that of dreams, that of creativity. It rules Pisces. It rules the idea of being able to connect with things that are dreams and make them realities. Well, once in a person's life, you go through a midlife crisis for about 9 months, give or take a few months. Neptune becomes squared during this time. In other words, you got a nice square, it's going to interfere. Or it's kind of a wake-up call to be able to say, like, you're going to die if you don't do this the right way. That's what it's actually talking about when the 6th and the 9th house form that square. So in this moment, you have this Neptune square, this midlife crisis, this idea that he had to kind of clean up his act. It was really important. Now, it's in Sagittarius, right? And he's a natural, he's got fire all over the place. So, of course, Neptune moves into a fire sign. It's at the 26-degree angle, and it comes together with Lilith. Well, Lilith in Sagittarius is about touching the third rail. It's about saying, oh, I know that pot is hot, but I'm going to grab it anyway so that I can see it. By the way, you might mix firearms and cocaine during this time, said a friend of mine once that told me. But it helps you understand how important astrology is. On this date, he had a almost near square, and the days leading up to it, it was square Neptune. That's how important that square Neptune is. Makes you do some crazy stuff sometime. Wouldn't you say there, David? Just a little bit. So that's one aspect of his life. And by the way, his bandmates looked out for him, made sure that he got it together. Even Neil Young came back to the band because he said, I don't want to lose you. You're too good to me. Remember in his natal chart how Saturn was sitting in his second house? Yeah, he had life mates. If you became a friend of David Crosby, you were going to be a friend for life. And what he really cared about, and by the way, notice how it's also coming right up against that 10th house of his Capricorn. He had to burn out before his reputation kind of got in the way. By the way, the Sagittarius moon sitting there too. That's just a nice, that's just a nice touch by the universe to say, we're going to be emotional about it. And by the way, he was a little disgraced. He was a little sully, but he's a rock star, damn it. He played at Woodstock. He hangs out with Mick Jagger. He's birthing babies with Melissa Etheridge. That's the really cool part, by the way. But take a look at also with this, what Jupiter is doing, what Saturn is doing, sitting there in the 7th house. This was the activator to say his friends, his network, his relationships to say, don't worry, buddy, we're going to bring it back to balance. Saturn sitting there in Libra, kind of just, one is Stills and one is Nash, turning to him and saying, we got to take care of our buddy. We got to take care of our friends. I remember when Stills actually talked about him, who was really the leader of that band, by the way. He really kind of set the tone to be able to say, no, we're going to take care of him. It's kind of a good thing, right? So that's why those activities are so important there. They really came through. And by the way, is it normal in the record industry to have your bandmates look out for you and still give you writing credit so you'll have revenue while you're away and getting cleaned up? Not at all. Hence Jupiter in Scorpio. I love this work, wouldn't you say? All right, guys. Well, fast forward into this. He's not only known for, and by the way, he subsequently went in and out of rehab. Well, the next significant thing that happened to him in his life was in 1994. This is when he needed a liver transplant. After all of the drugs and ammunition that he kind of went through, his liver really took its toll. And he was really up against it. He was a candidate, but he wasn't really a candidate. But he's famous, right? Well, I don't know if you know this. In 1994, liver transplants of any kind, were still ridiculously expensive. Well, in comes, and I hope I get this one right, his old friend Phil Collins, who in 1994 pulled him aside and said, I will pay for your liver transplant. Without that, it never would have happened. Now, I think other stars came about to it, but Phil Collins was the one that said, David Crosby is worth keeping around. He means a lot to me. He means a lot to music. And if I can pay for that, what do I need this money for? So all your Susu Studio money went to David Crosby and his liver. Now, you can be critical and say that David Crosby actually, from the lifestyle that he lived, he was a type 2 diabetic and he had hepatitis C. Well, again, you can be critical about a lifestyle choice with all of those statements, but here's Phil Collins coming through. So anytime I hear Phil Collins as this crotchety old man, I just want to simply remind you that he had no problem making sure his friend David Crosby was able to make it through the night with that. Bear with me as I go to make this change here. One of the things that he also had a very serious, oh, this is the one. That's not the one. We're professionals here. Did I not put this in? Well, we're going to take a look at this here in just a second, and I'm just going to keep talking. What's your favorite Phil Collins song? Go ahead and put it down below. I don't get out much, but when I do, it's late at night and nobody's looking. And I have no bosses of my own, so guess what? I get to kind of make it up as I go along. All right, here we go. Thank you, producer that I don't have. All right, let's take a look at his chart. When he got the actual transplant, it happened on November 21st, 1994. Now, remember how we're taking a look at kind of the right-hand side of this? He was a miracle waiting to happen. I mean, he truly was. When you think about this, at the end of the day, who gets a liver transplant? Typically not somebody that is a Hep C survivor, not somebody that's a type 2 diabetic. But take a look at this David Crosby event chart for this day. Anybody see anything important? Well, you can notice that Chiron was making a move over his North Node and his Neptune. Hello, Neptune, my old friend. And by the way, in being conjunct, and a wide conjunct, but inside the conjunct rules, he's got Venus sitting there. So this was about him and his health. The 6th house representing your personal health is a critical part of David Crosby's path. He needed to heal from this, and quite frankly, he needed a miracle. The energy in the sky was dominating the 8th house. You had Pluto, you had Jupiter, you had Mercury. Oh, by the way, the North Node was making a calling card here too. What's interesting most about this entire part of the chart is that he actually has the idea that others were looking out for him. The 8th house is other people's money. They were using their power to make sure that he was going to make it through the night. This is a pretty remarkable thing. By the way, Venus sitting there in the 7th house is the opportunity that friends could show how much they care. You know, at the end of the day, David Crosby had a lot of friends that really looked out for him. And it really plays out in this relationship house. It is not necessarily something where he was in a position to do it himself. Now, I don't know what his financial situation was, but it's reasonable to think that not everybody can afford a liver transplant. How did he get on the list? How did he get whatever? There were probably some wheels that needed to be greased. However, to be able to become a legend that he is, and by the way, Phil Collins actually pushed the buttons on this one, allowed him to find the healing that he needed to. Chiron was sitting over his North Node. This is a really, really important thing here. And of course, because I do all my own stunts, I have to make sure that I have this this chart. I have one more chart to show you guys, and I'm just going to load it into the computer here because I want to show you the last significant date for David Crosby, and that's on the day that he passed. Now, listen, we all have our flaws, right? We have addiction, we have whatever, but this is the ability to be able to give back to somebody that gave you something great. Music is an amazing tool. Music is something that when you're able to give back to somebody, it's really, truly amazing when you're able to meet and thank somebody. I remember years ago, I was able to, anytime I ever find somebody that, you know, or run into somebody that I'm like really inspired by, a musician, even a sports star, even a baseball player, but musicians or actors primarily, for the simple reason that, you know, I'll never forget it. I met this one person who is in an obscure band, but just their music changed my life. And when they got in front of me, I didn't sit there and jibber jab. I didn't sit there and go like, and this is my favorite thing, and I just simply thanked them. That's what Phil Collins did for David Crosby. Now, taking a look here at the end game for him, he passed on January 18th, 2023. He passed in his home in Hollywood, California. That's where I kept the chart for most of it. And again, there may be wobbles and there may be anomalies, but here we are. The moon tended to be in Sagittarius. Nice nod, universe. You also have the part where Neptune plays its role. Neptune playing a role? You betcha. Take a look at Neptune in the 12th house. 12th house. It's moving over his south node, his southern cross. Neptune is allowing his dreams to just jettison through a portal. Jupiter sitting here in a very wide conjunct. Actually, not really. Just outside of the conjunct. You wouldn't necessarily call this a conjunct if you were an astrologer, but you might have if you were talking about the days leading up to it. And notice how the outpouring of who David Crosby was, the stories that you didn't know about, the friendships that came out, the ideas and the stories that helped him along the way. Take a look at that 11th house. His network, his inspiration. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young at times was about changing the norm for you to look at the social atrocities that were. True songwriters that were able to talk and tell a story about the perils of not waking up. They would embrace things like, ufology. They would embrace things like, hey, social equality. And here is Saturn sitting in Aquarius in the 11th house in perfect harmony. By the way, the rising sign on the day that he passed was Aries. Leo was in the 5th house. And the 12th house became Pisces again. The dreamer, the water sign. By the way, when you look at intuition, you always look at the 4th, the 8th, and the 12th house. That's psychic identity. Well, he's void of the 8th house. He's void of the 4th house. And in the 12th house, he has the moon and the very comfortable placement of the south node. This man created his entire life. He had incredible friends. Also, not to be too dramatic, his sun was in his nadir. The sun was almost as far away as it possibly could be from him, from his natal sun. So his life force, his energy, was really just weakened. David Crosby lived an amazing life. You can be critical from the outside, but none of us lived it. His creative prowess was incredible. And he always did it with his friends. That's why we know Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, and not just David Crosby. We're going to give you the hard taps, David Crosby. And I want you all to go listen to your favorite Crosby, Stills, Nash, and or Young song right now. For me, it is Southern Cross. It's the earworm that gets in there, and I can't get rid of it. It only topped the charts at number 18, but if you lived in upstate New York, it was on WTRY every heavy rotation for about 2 years. And oh, by the way, his Chiron sitting there in Aries, he had done everything he wanted to do. All right, David, thank you so much for sharing your life story through astrology with us. I want to honor you with giving, I think I've got a pretty good picture here of him getting a little, oh, look at that picture. Look at the simplicity of a man who just owned that. And you had a chance to take a look at his chart. Be grateful. I know I am. Going to give each other the hard tap to remind you to love and care for one another and to simply keep going. I almost cut my hair. I'm sorry, but waiting to say that. I think I've said it 5 times in this video. All right, guys, keep going. Thanks for tuning in to Stream of Consciousness. Like and subscribe. Become a member. See all the stuff behind the scenes. I'll see you.